Good afternoon, and thank you for joining me for what promises to be an exciting conversation with author Ernest Scheyder about his new book, The War Below: Lithium, Copper, and the Global Battle to Power Our Lives. I'm Abigail Hunter, the director of SAFE's Ambassador Alfred Hoffman Jr. Center for Critical Minerals Strategy. For those of you who are not familiar with SAFE, we are an action-oriented, nonpartisan nonprofit focused on transportation, energy, and supply chain policies that advance the economic and national security of the United States and our allies. For the last 20 years, SAFE has convened business and military leaders to advance more sustainable and resilient supply chains with a primary focus on reducing the nation's oil dependence. And overlapping that time, Ernest was covering the shale revolution and relevant politics and environment beats. Early on, SAFE advocated for using less and using alternatives like electric vehicles to decrease supply vulnerabilities in the transportation sector. Today, deploying electric vehicles to diversify our fuel sources is much closer in reach. However, that reality comes with an even larger geopolitical threat. Pick a mineral, cobalt, lithium, rare earth elements, pick a supply chain segment: extraction, refining, processing, separation, the transformation into the battery guts, electronic guts. The numbers range from 60 to 90% in terms of China's chokehold. China is OPEC squared when it comes to their ability to maneuver and manipulate the market for minerals. Here, Ernest and SAFE find ourselves on the same path again. SAFE founded the Center for Critical Minerals Strategy in 2020 after publishing our Commanding Heights for Transportation report. Around that time, Ernest shifted his focus to minerals in the green transition that require those minerals. Both of those shifts were felt. I remember first hearing Ernest's name at one of my monthly happy hours for Ladies in Critical Minerals in Washington, D.C. There, we share tidbits about who's leading what in the US government on minerals, what this executive order meant, articles that we should read to stay current on this fast-moving conversation. One of our founding members said we absolutely needed to follow Ernest on Twitter to keep up, and we began passing around her phone so we could quickly start following him. Beyond self-congratulating Ernest and SAFE for our prescience, I think it's also important to emphasize the timing of our respective pivots. 4 years ago, in the pandemic, we began to wake up to supply chain vulnerabilities more broadly. Today, and for the first time since the end of the Second World War, the United States has a meaningful and holistic industrial strategy. Energy and transportation are at the center of this evolution, and critical minerals are the foundation on which this transition will be built. And the United States is not alone. Our partners and allies share the tall order of trying to reindustrialize and transition away from oil dependence while navigating the complex geopolitical landscape and growing security challenges it presents. These are big picture issues with big picture policies to essentially shift our entire way of life and the supply chains that enable it. But what I loved about Ernest's book is it zooms in. He focuses on the people and the communities who feel the benefits and the cost of this massive switch from a fossil fuel-based economy to a minerals-based one in their daily lives. The realities of these impacts, big and small, are of great interest to the Minerals Center at SAFE. We are dedicated to building secure, sustainable, and ethical supply chains for critical minerals used in batteries, defense applications, leaf blowers, etc. We believe infusing these supply chains with our values will help us diversify away from non-market and anti-democratic actors who are leveraging their market share for geopolitical gains. I'll give you one last item for your reading list. SAFE's Minerals Center vision and proposals are in our inaugural report, A Global Race to the Top Using Transparency to Secure Critical Mineral Supply Chains. But add that only after you've read The War Below. And on that note, let's get started. My guest today, Ernest, is a senior correspondent at Reuters, covering clean energy transition and critical minerals, as previously noted. His book, The War Below, was published on Tuesday. Ernest, thanks so much for being here. Let's dive in.
Great to be with you, Abigail.
So as my lengthy opening remarks imply, this is a very complicated space. So I want to ask first, what's the number one thing you want to get across about this story to your readers and to the potential readers that are thinking about buying the book?
So the number one thing that I really wanted to bring to the audience with The War Below was the concept of choice. And after writing this book, I'm convinced more than ever that an author gets to ask one question of the audience. And the question I'm bringing to the audience here is, what are the choices we're willing to make if we want this energy transition, if we want to help fight climate change with the use of electric vehicles and solar panels and wind turbines, and also if we want these everyday electronics that are increasingly being powered by lithium-ion batteries? We're not really having that choice broadly. I think in certain circles it is there, but it's not a conversation that we're having in across the United States and really the world. What are the choices we're willing to make to get lithium and copper and cobalt and nickel? And I think for too long, people have just been acceptive of the fact that you just show up to a store and buy this stuff. And that's just not really how it happens. The core of the book, if you'll forgive the mining pun, it really revolves around the story of the Rhyolite Ridge Lithium project in Nevada, about 200 miles north of Las Vegas. And there, this massive deposit of lithium has enticed a mining company that would like to develop it as part of its plan to supply the green energy transition. But that site also is the home to a rare flower found nowhere else on the planet that is eventually, as the story unpacks, declared endangered by the US government. So therein lies one of the core tension points of the book. What matters more, the lithium to help define climate change or biodiversity? And I go through in detail in the narrative the pros and cons, the people on both sides of this issue, to bring to the audience this core issue of choice, which I see as the main theme of the book.
Yeah, that definitely comes across. And not that you have us rooting for either side. I definitely found myself divided as I unpacked the story. So, building on that and appreciating the environmental and safety implications of these mining and processing projects, and what you just said about kind of this barrier of where we're getting these materials from today, I'm curious if the opacity of our current supply chains came up in your conversations with interviewees and whether there's this awareness of where we're getting them, regardless of if it's domestic or not, do have the environmental and standards challenges that all mining projects present.
Sure. One of the projects that I look at in the book is the proposed twin metals cobalt, copper, and nickel project in northern Minnesota. And this would be an underground mine that, if developed, would be a massive source of all three of those metals for the United States. And it's being developed by a company known as Twin Metals, as the name implies. It's controlled by Antofagasta. The tension there, though, revolves around the rock that contains those metals. And if it's extracted out of the ground and it interacted with water, it could form an acid. And northern Minnesota, if you look at a map, it's right next to the Great Lakes. And so there's a lot of concern by conservationists and others in the region, which is heavily trafficked by canoeists and other outdoor recreational enthusiasts, that if there was some kind of major accident and you had a big acid spill or leakage, that you could pollute the Great Lakes, which is sort of the beating heart of the North American waterway infrastructure when we think about it. So there's obviously there's obviously a very large concern about the potential environmental degradation, as well as how would you clean that up if that happened? Now, I should note here that the company has said it's very confident that that would never happen, and that has been part of its plans. But the mine, as we sit here today, is essentially on ice. It's been frozen by the Biden administration, and Congress, some in Congress, are taking steps that could potentially permanently block mining in that region. And that has incensed a lot of the politicians and some of the labor unions there because they point out, as you were saying, Abigail, where we get cobalt, especially from today. It's from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where some of the world's largest mining companies, including many based in China, have set up operation there. And in some very tragic instances, you can have young children around 6 or 7 actively be part of the mining there of this cobalt, which goes into the supply chain and is very hard to trace. So it's hard to know if the cobalt in your iPhone was extracted in unsafe conditions in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Oftentimes, we can see children being maimed or injured by part of this production process there, or even killed. And so I'm not necessarily saying it's that black and white, that if we have this mine in northern Minnesota, that we definitely won't have child labor issues in the Congo. I think we can all agree we don't want child labor to be part of the mining industry, but the conversations about what are the choices we're willing to make, it necessarily involves the questions of where in the United States we want to produce these critical minerals. And are we comfortable by putting our heads in the sand and saying, well, this cobalt that is coming out of the ground in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, it might be produced in unsafe conditions, but out of sight, out of mind. So I really, really wanted to unpack that and sort of demyth and sort of just bring the opacity to people and sort of reveal this a little bit more, is that this stuff comes from somewhere, the building blocks for all of these devices. And I just hope folks think that through more when they read the book.
Yeah, definitely. Everybody who is tuned in watching this here today, plug their computer in somewhere, that electricity,
Exactly.
anything with an on off switch demands minerals. So I think that's really an important message to get across. So you mentioned the Twin Metals project, which has copper, cobalt, nickel, and then also the project in Nevada that focuses on lithium. Your title has copper and lithium prominently featured. So I'm curious, out of all the minerals, why did you really focus on those two?
I mean, for me, they're the workhorses really of the green energy transition, and so I really wanted to look at the import of those. Not to say that nickel and cobalt and rare earths are not as important; they are certainly part of the narrative. But you can't have a lithium-ion battery without lithium, and you can't have many of these electronics with wiring that's made from copper. So for me, it's just the import of both of those really was key to put in the subtitle to sort of grab the reader and pull her or him in to the importance of this topic. So that's why I focused on those in the subtitle, but the entire narrative looks at sort of what I would call sort of all five subsectors of critical minerals, as well as some even minor metals and minerals as well.
Great, that makes sense. And then I want to maybe pull on, our shared history and your coverage and SAFE's roots. I'm curious when you started to see the parallels between the shale revolution and what was happening with minerals and how that informed your perspective for the war below.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so in a previous life, as you mentioned, I covered crude oil, including OPEC, and so spent a lot of time at OPEC meetings, chasing various ministers. And the more I reported on that space, and then when I transitioned to this space, I definitely saw parallels. I mean, certainly they're both involving large energy infrastructures and their commodity markets, and so supply and demand does affect them. There's obviously a huge regulatory approach to both industries. Washington, D.C. and others have things to say about oil extraction, as well as copper and lithium and nickel extraction and many other critical minerals. And so in that regard, there was similarities. But I would say the production process for critical minerals is vastly different than for petroleum. I think most people understand roughly what an oil refinery does. You sort of put crude oil in and you get out jet fuel or kerosene or gasoline, et cetera, et cetera. But the production process for many of these critical minerals can be very different depending on what you're processing. I mean, lithium can be produced either with an open pit, sort of what people think of generally when they think of mining, a hole in the ground, or by taking brine out of the ground, essentially salty water, and then using large evaporation ponds. And then it needs to be processed into two other types that, depending on the type of manufacturing you're doing and type of battery you want to build, might be of interest. It has to be refined to specific quality specifications based on the end use. So whether it's an electric vehicle or a stopwatch battery, there was a vastly different quality specifications. And that's just lithium. We don't even get into sort of copper or rare earths. Rare earths can take weeks to process, depending. And so the complexity of the supply chain there was something that really was evident to me. In terms of cartel for these critical minerals, I was fascinated by how some countries, especially in South America, would hope to use their prowess and their reserves of these battery metals in order to boost their presence on the global stage. One chapter in the book specifically focuses on Bolivia, which has the world's largest lithium resource. And I chronicle the journey of a tech developer from Austin who is trying to use direct lithium extraction to gain entry into Bolivia's large lithium reserves. And so I go through the history of not only the country, Bolivia itself, but also its tortured connection with lithium development in the past. Could this moment be different? That's a key thing that we explore in the book. Bolivia's president has made it clear, though, that he would like to form a kind of lithium OPEC with Chile and Argentina. How that will play out, I think, will have huge geopolitical implications for the years ahead.
Yeah, the complexities that you're describing and then the unilateral action that's being taken all over the world, it doesn't make the job of the policymakers in the United States very easy.
No.
And so going back to kind of the root of that question around the focus and noting, the diverse kind of lens you've taken with other minerals, we got a great question from an audience member in Bobby Ridaway. And forgive my pronunciation, Bobby, if that's not correct. But he said, I'm fascinated by the choice discussion. Can't wait to read this book. Which of these minerals, if any, have the easiest choices and which are the hardest? So easy question for you, Ernest.
I think it depends on the region, right? And it depends on a specific mineral. One of the things that I I think I was maybe not most surprised, but most intrigued to learn when I was reporting out this book is how divergent views are on extractive projects, depending on where you are in the world. And so I certainly remembered when I covered the oil and gas industry, I spent 2 years living in North Dakota covering the oil industry there. There are some people that are very pro oil and natural gas, and then there are some that are vociferously opposed. And I feel like it can be sort of a stereotypical trope to sort of be anti oil or pro oil. And what I discovered here is when I reported more on the critical mineral space is just because a mine might produce a critical mineral for the energy transition did not necessarily mean that everybody that lived next door to that was saying, "Oorah, I'm going to support the energy transition here." I saw this most pointedly just outside Charlotte, North Carolina, where there's this massive lithium deposit that a company would like to develop there. And it's surrounded by this bucolic farming paradise, the people that have had land that they handed down through the generations. And they're people that really have history baked into the dirt. And so the idea of coming and building a 500-foot deep mine that would use a lot of water, would have dynamite blasting all hours of the day, is anathema to them, even if that project would support and produce lithium for the green energy transition. So the more and more I unpack this, the more I realize that, while certainly people oppose oil wells for reasons that are all over the map, that not necessarily going to say yes to every single lithium mine or copper mine or cobalt mine or nickel mine. And so the social license to operate is, in some places, harder with this transition than it was with the oil and gas revolution 100 years ago. So the complexities there, I hope people understand more. And I try to bring that to the audience in the book.
Yeah, and I think notably that lithium deposit you're mentioning, that company is working on a lithium hydroxide facility nearby, and they're going to be getting feedstock from north of the border in Quebec, and then after that
Yes.
from Ghana. And so again, it's kind of this question of choice that you're really leaning into. If it's not going to come from here, where else are we going to get it? Are we comfortable with that supply chain? And yeah,
Exactly.
very, very interesting. We got another question from the audience from an anonymous individual. What are your opinions on the potential of having a lithium cartel, as you just alluded to? And can we build an oil like cartel when the critical minerals have such complex supply chains, as you just walked us through? The different specialty applications with a wide range of specs make that harder, certainly, right? To have that leverage that oil does.
Yeah, I think those are all good points and good and great question. Depending on who you talk to, lithium is either a commodity or a specialty chemical. Certainly, the industry has positioned the product as a specialty chemical because it requires so much processing. And so I think that'll be an interesting thing to track in the coming years is like, can we say that we're going to have like a collective control, a cartel for lithium when different manufacturers have different quality specs out there? I'm curious to see where it goes, especially from a technological standpoint. There is a lot of lithium out there in the world right now. I mean, there's a lot of lithium in seawater, for instance. It's obviously at extremely low concentrations. One of the things I chronicle in the book is attempts to develop direct lithium extraction, which is a sort of nascent type of technology. It's really a grouping of technologies that would filter lithium from these salty brines, sort of like a household water softener. That's sort of a gross simplification, but in essence, that's what the technologies aim to do. None of them have worked at commercial scale before, and if one or more could go commercial, that could help places like Bolivia or the United States produce a lot more. And so you can imagine in that scenario, if you have sort of a lithium OPEC, would it matter because places across the world that might have lower concentrations of lithium in brine deposits would still be able to produce their own lithium. So I'm just sort of thinking through the economics there. And I explore the history of direct lithium extraction, including the man that invented an early type of this DLE in the book, and chronicle also his attempts to get Elon Musk and Tesla on board. So I'll sort of leave that as a bit of a tease there. But I am curious to see the interaction between the development of direct lithium extraction, which has attracted folks like ExxonMobil, as well as to see that interaction with plans by some in La Paz and Santiago and elsewhere to try to make this kind of lithium cartel. We'll see where it goes in the coming years, but for me, it's a question of technology more than it is a question of geopolitics.
Yeah. Great point. And I think the root of that question is really reflective of what SAFE's been advocating for a long time. This belief that if we're diversifying our fuel sources for the transportation sector using electric vehicles, we won't have that immediate pain point when the price at the pump goes up. That really obviously motivates political action and can
Yeah.
hurt households. So you have this ability to curb that immediate reaction on individuals by having something that you get here and have operating and can recharge, right? And so on that too, you talk about recycling as well in the book if you wanted to kind of dive into the implications there of what it means for us when we have access to these materials and their second use lives in certain cases.
Sure. I chronicle the history of J.B. Straubel's Redwood, as well as A.J. Kachar's Life Cycle in the book. For me, it was really important to unpack the recycling question. Not an easy question to unpack there either. Also, an issue of choice. One of the things that I think surprised me, and I think surprises other people, is just sort of the most or the expensive, the most costly part of the recycling supply chain right now is transportation. And you can imagine having, hundreds of old cell phone batteries in a rail car. That would be potentially dangerous because these things are all charged. And indeed, I chronicle an incident where one of these rail cars blew up on its way to a recycling facility. So seeing the history of life cycle, they've got this hub and spoke model is what they call it. And Redwood has its own sort of approach to recycling. And they're part of this larger ecosystem around, can we get to this idea of a circular economy, the idea that, cell phones and electric vehicles and old battery powered devices that Abigail, you and I and everyone in the audience might have, at our end of life, can those be turned in? Can the metals be processed out and then put back into new devices? Because petroleum obviously is burned off when it's used for internal combustion and other uses, but you can reuse lithium and copper and other critical minerals again and again and again, which is a huge part of the appeal. There's a lot of estimates as to say when we're going to actually get to sort of that tipping point when we don't need to dig a new mine and we can reuse all these old electronics on new devices. I don't know when that'll be. I don't think anyone has any sense of when that could be beyond sort of maybe 2050, maybe 2060. And I think it's anyone's guess there, but I think it's a goal that a lot of folks are moving towards. And interestingly, mining companies are too. We mentioned Albemarle earlier. They've got these plans for a very large lithium refinery in the United States. And as part of their drawing board, they are integrating recycling plans into part of that, knowing that eventually lithium recycling will be a larger part of their business model. But for the meantime, we're going to need a lot more of these critical minerals produced by mines. Just the sheer data demand projections to show us that if we want to hit net zero by 2050, we're going to have to sharply increase our production of all of these critical minerals, which means we're going to have to be thinking about where, how, and why we produce them.
Oh, that's a really important point. I wrote one of SAFE's aluminum reports where I think one of the biggest things we had to emphasize early on was the fact that, yes, aluminum itself is highly recyclable, but we still need substantial amounts of primary aluminum to be able to meet the clean energy transition, its current application uses in buildings and defense and aerospace. We can't just recycle our way out of the problem in the short term, as you alluded to.
Right,
So
exactly.
getting a lot of really great questions from the audience, and maybe this is a good one to follow on to the question of circularity. So Melissa Barbanel asked, what is your sense on processing and traceability? If mining increases in the US, will it be easier to trace minerals from mine to end product? Can this drive improved performance?
Great question. Tracking the provenance of a metal is actually part of the narrative in what might seem like a whimsy or innocuous way, but bear with me if you'll forgive this small anecdote. A few years ago, I got a house and I got a backyard of my own, and I decided to go in all electric. I was starting to write this book and wanted to sort of explore this area. So I got an electric lawnmower and an electric weed whacker and an electric leaf blower. And so I had this whole chapter on this electric leaf blower, and it's a great tool. I highly recommend it. But it brought me down this journey of where did the metals come from that built the battery that powers that leaf blower. And this is a very common lithium ion battery. And the whole point of the system is that you can swap the batteries in and out. So for me, the idea of writing about this for the book was to bring to the audience this idea that it's not just about electric vehicles. This issue of this green energy transition is about so much more than transportation. It's about every single device that we use in our homes that is increasingly powered by lithium ion batteries. And I got to tell you, like in my day job at Reuters, I have a lot of resources, thankfully, and a lot of connections with great people like Abigail and others at SAFE and other think tanks. I couldn't figure out where these metals came from that powered this leaf blower. I couldn't figure out if the copper had come from Peru, where there's a lot of farmers that have bitterly complained that copper production there destroys their crops. I couldn't figure out if the lithium had started its journey in northern Chile and then gone across the Pacific to a cathode facility and then come back across the Pacific as it made its way into my local home hardware store in the form of the leaf blower. I couldn't figure out if a 7-year-old in the Congo took that cobalt out of the ground. And it was extremely hard. And that's just for a little lowly leaf blower. Now magnify that across the millions and millions and millions of devices sold every single day across the world that are powered by these lithium ion batteries. And for me, that crystallizes the import here of why we need to understand these supply chains a lot better. And if there was more of these metals produced domestically, or at least in the region, would that abrogate the need to rely on other countries? Probably yes, and also give us greater transparency on the supply chain. It was 4 years ago this month that the world really started to grapple with the beginnings of the coronavirus pandemic. And what was the first thing we all learned? Really, that the United States doesn't make any masks. That was a huge shocker for a lot of people. They realized that the production of this really essential yet basic medical device was not made in the United States or even regionally. It was made in Asia. And so I think that reinforced to people the importance of understanding supply chains. While a normally sleepy topic, it reinforced the need to understand them that much better. And when we have this energy transition accelerating day by day by day, we need to understand more where these building blocks come from.
That's an extremely important point, and when Ernest and I were talking about setting up this book talk, he did, tease my interest with the chapter on the leaf blower, so I can say it was really entertaining to read and go follow your kind of path down that road. So we have, we have great audience questions coming in, which is a testament to your knowledge and the wonderful topics of this book. I think an important one too, especially as you walked through some of the questions about recycling. A big thing that we've been hearing right now is the plummeting price of critical minerals, commodities,
Mm,
making it less economic to recycle the materials because it's just so cheap to use virgin materials. And so the
right.
question from Norma Mosey really gets at this. Critical mineral investment plummeted last year as private sector struggled with the economics, low commodity prices. What, if any, role can the US government play to make investments attractive now?
Ooh, that's the $1 billion question. Great question though.
Trillions, maybe, $1 billion.
Trillion dollar at least, yes. I mean, we in my day job at Reuters and certainly in the book, I mean, I heard, I would say, two things that constantly came up. This idea of the U.S. government should be using its checkbook to what's called Buy American, which is this idea that if you're going to have the government purchase a lot of things ranging from paper clips to fighter jets, should the materials that are being used to build that be sourced domestically or at least with domestic partners. And so there's been various efforts across the supply chains, especially in the Pentagon, to do more of that. We saw the Pentagon recently take steps. I believe it was on cathodes, if I'm not mistaken, Abigail, and saying we would not buy cathodes for certain equipment that was built in China. And so we're starting to see that. I mean, the chicken or egg problem with mines, though, is if you have the financial support, it's not necessarily going to be for all of the offtake, perhaps from the U.S. government, and so you still need to find other customers out there, and that they can still be affected by the commodity price that's out there, whether that's on a futures exchange or by a commodity pricing provider. One other area that I'm exploring in my day job right now is sort of on efforts to set a price or predict a price that the Pentagon is exploring with artificial intelligence.
Mm,
And the angle by this seems to be to sort of send a signal for what the value of a particular product would be. That dovetails with efforts by some in industry to move forward on the idea of a premium price for metals that are produced at ESG standards that are acceptable by its customers. So the idea, basically, if you want ethically sourced nickel, you're going to have to pay a premium for that product. You're not just going to pay the lowest common denominator. And the idea there is that mines, especially in the United States, are held to very high standards, and other parts of the world that produce critical minerals may not be held to them. And being held to a high standards has a cost associated with it. So the feeling is that you should have a price that corresponds to those higher costs. One of the things I unpack in the book is the genesis of IRMA, the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance. And this is a standard schema that was developed over 10 or 15 years, partly by Tiffany and Company, the jeweler, as well as other groups, to try to set best practices for mining. And these are the folks that are trying to hold miners to a higher standard for water usage, for how much they pay their workers, for how they respond to safety standards, for how they interact with the host communities. All of those things certainly have costs. So I could see in time a movement to have maybe two different prices out there for critical minerals if that evolves to that point. Because the last thing the last thing the auto industry wants is to be looking back 50 years from now and see that it made the same mistakes that it did during the internal combustion engine's heyday. That is to say, that they don't want to say, by producing more electric vehicles, we have led to harm around copper mines or lithium mines or nickel mines. We want to know that the critical minerals that we produce are ethically sourced, and that probably will have a higher cost associated with it.
Yeah, it's very interesting, this question on a high standard premium. And I think obviously we advocate for high standard critical mineral projects as a way to start to diversify away from China. We see that grip, that chokehold China has on these things being kind of eased by the ability to invest in these projects that in countries where they have these high standards. I think it's very interesting that, Tiffany and Co. was really a leading kind of motivator around IRMA, because there you see maybe a willingness and premium in their end products to have that. And so the question,
Yeah.
befalls, are we going to be able to justify that for these other applications in our materials, noting how complex and, manyfold they are in our day-to-day lives. Another question that came in that's maybe a little bit unfair, but I'm going to ask it anyway, relevant to this. And this is from Scott Gemperline. Your comments have focused on considerations and potential scenarios of several extraction projects. In your research, did you identify a model mine in the United States that is currently producing that effectively embodies a social license to operate? So picking favorites.
Oh gosh. I love all my children equally. That's the saying, right? One of the chapters in the book, I do go to an active major mine in the United States. That's the Morenci mine, run by Freeport-McMoRan in Arizona, and it's the largest mine in North America of any metal. It was important for me to show the reader an active mine site that has been there for more than a century, that has worked to have good relations with its neighbors, including indigenous rights groups, and that has worked through issues around water, and other conservation issues. And I'm not necessarily holding them out as the best run mine in the world, but it was important for me to say that this is a mine that is respected by its neighbors, that produces a lot of vital building blocks, that has been there for more than a century, and to paint the picture of sort of the complexity of the operation, because this is a vast, huge open pit mine. There's actually, I think, 7 or 8 pits at the site, giant leaching pads, huge tailing storage facilities, and this mine is, as mines do, grown over the course of a century, really, at this site. And so I try to show the reader the just gargantuan nature of this project, to underscore that this is an active industry right now, especially in the United States, and this is how you get copper. And this is how you get many, many other critical minerals. So it was important, like I say, to show that and to bring that to the reader. And I'm excited to have you read about it, and then maybe we can compare notes on what you think about Morenci.
That's great. Very insightful. I also wanted to note that in your comments earlier, the fiscal year 2024 National Defense Authorization Act banned the purchase of batteries from China. So it was more the end product. Maybe
Gotcha,
that you
not
and I would
catheters.
like to
Okay,
see in terms of this consideration to the midstream and upstream.
gotcha.
Um, you've been in this world for a long time, and I'm sure when you started to put pen to paper for this book, you had to go back and talk to people more. And I'm just curious, as somebody who's been steeped in this, what was the thing that surprised you most in your writing of this book? And I wrote down a long list of things that I maybe needed demythed or corrected, because even though I spend every day waking up thinking about critical minerals, the context you provide is quite enlightening.
I think for me, and this might get maybe broadly philosophical, so bear with me, but I think too often, especially in our society, we're used to thinking of issues just being one side versus another. And for me, I mean, here, these are not just black versus white, one side versus the other. There are so many complexities here to a lot of these issues. And one area I saw this especially is in the fight over the Resolution Copper project in Arizona that BHP and Rio Tinto would like to develop there. This is about an hour east of Phoenix. And this massive copper deposit, it's about a mile or two underground, and it would be an underground mine that, if developed, would over time cause this giant crater that would essentially swallow up a site considered of religious importance to many of the San Carlos Apache people. And they consider this site as important as Roman Catholics would consider St. Peter's Basilica, for instance. And so I take readers through the narrative here, through the journey of this. You've got this mining company on one hand, trying to develop it. You've got the indigenous rights groups on the other. And so you would think, sort of stereotypically, that these two opposing sides would be there. But there's the third and fourth, and perhaps even fifth or sixth consideration here. Certainly, you've got politics that's in play. President Trump approved this mine not long after January 6th, and then President Biden unapproved the mine a few months later. But then increasingly, you've got a very vocal group of folks in the nearby town of Superior, Arizona, which is very low in the socioeconomic strata, average income there about $20,000 a year. And I got to meet Mayor Mila Bisic, who has been the mayor of this town for several years, and she is firmly in support of this project. Now, she doesn't necessarily advocate for the mining industry all the time, but she sees her mission is to bring jobs to her town, and she is very vocal that President Biden, in her words, needs to make a choice. There's this idea of choice again, and so it's not just one side versus the other often in many of these projects. There's a third or fourth side here where folks have very different and divergent perspectives that are coming at it. And that adds to the complexity here, and I think necessitates sort of that deepening of that thought process around choice.
Yeah, definitely a very, very, very well written chapter. I think you struck a great balance there. And, as somebody who spends a lot of time with those two mining companies, I think I appreciated the full scope understanding of the challenges in developing that mine potential for, its critical end uses for the copper it has there. Um, you just went through and kind of listed so many different stakeholder groups that are in these conversations, and you have great quotes, whether it's from the mayor or members of the Biden administration or lawmakers on the Hill or these communities. You have these quotes sprinkled in, implying great conversations and interviews. And I just want to ask you maybe twofold, what was the tone of those conversations with the officials, the government representatives, and then what was the tone of those with the companies? Are people optimistic about our future to develop these mining projects at home, abroad, or is it mostly pessimistic that we're going to continue on the same maybe veiled curtain path?
So I think broadly among a lot of the politicians, I heard a lot of hope that there could be some kind of agreement domestically on how and where we want to get these critical minerals. Certainly, voices like Senator Joe Manchin, voices like Representative Eric Swalwell, and Senator Lisa Murkowski have advocated for perhaps a streamlining, if you will, of the regulations that oversee this industry and increased domestic production. And those names I just mentioned are Republicans and Democrats. So I see this truly as a bipartisan issue. But I would say that there is slowly a realization that sort of the efforts or the attempts to try to boost this domestic production needs to be grappled with on where the rubber meets the road, really, and that's on permitting and regulation. Take the Inflation Reduction Act, for instance. You get EV tax credits if you are building an EV with critical minerals produced domestically, a certain percentage produced domestically, or in countries with US free trade deals. But if you can't develop the mine, how are you going to get the tax credit? So it's a bit of a sort of chicken or egg thing there. Many countries in the world do not have US free trade deals. And we were talking about the Democratic Republic of the Congo earlier. The only country on the African continent with a US free trade deal is Morocco, not the DRC, not Zambia, not other countries on the continent with large critical minerals deposits. And so there's some, I think, connecting of the dots that needs to be made in order for that hope that I heard from a lot of politicians to be turned into action. From the industry's perspective, I would say it's similarly a desire for action as well. Not just with industry, but also those opposing industry. There's a confusing, it's just a confusion around what are the laws in order to produce a mine. Abigail, let's just take this thought exercise with me. Let's just say you own 1,000 acres in Oregon that you are convinced has a massive lithium deposit. What's the first step that you would take to get a permit? Who
Oh,
would
I
you
hate
talk
having the
to?
questions turned around me. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm not trying to flip the tables on you, but like, who would you call? Like, what agency in Washington would you need to call the state capitol? Would you need to hire a lawyer? Which lawyer? Which agency would you need to talk to for water or air? And when you sort of added up all of those issues, you can see sort of the complexity around it. And that sort of thing to me underscores the confusing nature of where Washington is right now on this issue, and I think perhaps our broader population, because we're not thinking through the importance of having more domestic production of these critical minerals if we want to fight climate change and if we want these technologies of the future.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really fair point. And on the first answer you gave around the governments, I'm headed to Cape Town on Saturday for Mining Indaba with
Mhm.
a large contingency from the US government. And one of the main focus areas of our conversations on the ground there is going to be the Inflation Reduction Act does not necessarily incentivize these countries going downstream to realize the benefits to GDP and job creation, value added components of the critical mineral supply chains leading to clean energy technologies like electric vehicles. But that should be the reason that we're focused more on the Partnership for Global Infrastructure Investment and the Lobito Corridor, the Mineral Security Partnership to draw investors to these projects to power our Prosper Africa, and to other programs that are trying to engage and really support the development of these programs while maintaining the high standards that we prioritize at home, and helping realize the economic development potential that these countries aspire to have through developing this sector. So I think it's really important, and I agree with your response on that. I think it's critical. And definitely, yeah, can't agree more on the private sector one. Having worked for the Quebec government, I immediately started answering the question for the Quebec stakeholders and proponents in the province. I do know how that works there, but maybe less relevant for this conversation. I think we have time for one last question, and I'm going to selfishly make it my own.
Sure.
We were talking before the call about how, the ending of your book really ties everything really beautifully together, but also kind of goes through all of these different convergences of events and the timing of, maybe a loan being given to one project for lithium and then, another project being kind of shut down by the government action. And then other opportunities where we'll see, the Defense Production Act being able be utilized to get projects on the ground in Canada. So again, at the same time that we're trying to support domestic mining. So again, you have this dual approach, and it's seemingly really happening because of the urgency of the situation. And as
Mhm.
your book really goes through to get these projects done right, it does demand a lot of time. And so I wanted to see, you know, where you land on that. Are we going to be able to meet the electric vehicle demand that is quick, and then still be able to get these projects while adhering to the standards and permits and community engagement that takes the time? Is that possible? Are you optimistic about that?
Well, what I would say is these projects in the United States can take a decade or longer to develop from start to the permitting process and then all the way to first production. And many can even take longer. As part of the reporting for the book, I visited the Twin Metals site, as I mentioned, and there is a small office building that the Twin Metals folks have developed there. And I interviewed folks there for the project. And as I left, they gave me a coffee mug and it said 10 years. It was celebrating a 10-year milestone. And the 10-year milestone was, I believe, in 2020 or 2022, that it had been under development. And here we are in 2024, and the mine is nowhere closer to being developed. And the company, that if they were part of this conversation here right now, would certainly say that they're, I'm sure, frustrated by that long development timeline there. And so that's just one particular project. There are many others that take usually 10 years or more. And so the question that I'm really bringing to the audience here is, do we think we'll have enough metals and minerals in order to go green by, let's just say, even 2030, when President Biden and others have talked about having fully electric fleets for the US federal government? And many automakers have talked about having a huge chunk, if not all, of their product base be fully electric. And not to mention the charging networks that need to be built for all of those electric vehicles. Do we really think we're going to get there? On top of that, I mean, are we comfortable if more and more of our everyday lives are powered by lithium ion batteries, that can continue to grow unabated if we're not thinking through production of these minerals on the virgin side with new mines, or thinking through more where are we willing to have recycling facilities and what are the choices there? So it doesn't seem right now that we're fully thinking through those questions, because essentially in the United States, what I'm chronicling is a series of no's to various projects across the United States, but not a fully thought through realization of, okay, where do we actually want to get these building blocks? Are we serious about climate change? Do we think that we need to be talking about where we get the critical minerals that underpin these devices that we use every single day? And so it does not seem right now that we're going to get there. And so these are big, deep seated questions. I really hope that folks dive into the book and that it sparks a conversation. It's not a book written for geologists or investors. It's written for everyone. It's a Thanksgiving dinner table book, if you will, here, and not to spark too many fights at Thanksgiving dinner. But it's because it's a topic that affects us all, right? This is and how we grapple with this will define the 21st century economy, because whoever controls the nickel and lithium and copper production this century will control the century's economy the way that crude oil and petroleum define the 20th century's economy. And I hope folks get a chance to dive into the book and explore the issues for themselves.
Thank you so much, Ernest. And I'll close out by just giving a really heartfelt recommendation for the book. Although I did get into a big fight last Thanksgiving about transmission lines with my family members, I will be recommending it to my parents so they understand what I do a little bit better. But even for experts in the space, I think it has something to give, and it certainly has a lot to give for people who are curious and interested about these supply chains and where we get these minerals. There's so much more to discuss on this topic, and so I want to tease out where you can continue to learn more about this area and then also connect with Ernest himself at a book signing. The Safe Summit 2024, Solving the Global Power Puzzle in Washington, D.C. on March 12th and 13th. We'll have political leaders, business leaders, all working parts of the energy and transportation supply chains tackling these issues. We've got folks like Representative Robert Whitman and Representative Kathy Castor, both of whom are members of the House Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party. They'll be speaking about Beijing's economic aggression around minerals and what the US can do about it. We'll have Jonathan Price, the CEO of Teck, one of Canada's leading mining companies. We'll have the chairman of LG Chem, Mr. Shin, one of the largest global suppliers of vital materials and chemicals that are the building blocks for batteries and manufacturing. And again, you'll have Ernest Scheyder there signing these books, and I'll certainly be getting mine signed when we see each other in person, Ernest. So thank you so much again. We hope to see you all at the Safe Summit, and happy reading.
Great to be with you all.